In 1947, two engineers pointed a machine made out of coffee cans at a highway in Connecticut and quietly ended something that had been true since the invention of the automobile. For 50 years, if a police officer wanted to prove you were speeding, he had to do one thing first. He had to go that fast himself. Think about what that actually meant. To testify in court that a driver was doing 90, an officer had to catch him, sit behind him, match his speed, and read his own dial. The evidence and the danger were the same act. Every pursuit car in this channel's history exists partly because of that one problem. And then, a device built to measure aircraft landing on a runway made the whole thing optional. This is the story of how American police learned to prove speed without chasing it. It runs from a pair of soldered-shut coffee cans on Long Island to a New Jersey courtroom that decided a machine could testify, and it ends with a piece of Victorian laboratory equipment that ended up in the boot of almost every patrol car in America. And at the end, I want to show you the two court cases, 3 years apart, that decided exactly how much proof a little black box actually needs. Start with the problem, because it is older than the solution by half a century. The method was called pacing. An officer spotted a car he believed was speeding, pulled in behind it, matched its speed, and read his own speedometer. That reading was the evidence, which is why the certified speedometer was a legal instrument rather than a convenience. Police packages specified a calibrated unit as an ordered option because an officer would have to swear to what it said under oath. But look at what pacing requires. To prove 100 miles an hour, somebody has to drive 100 miles an hour, usually on a road with other traffic, usually at night, in a car with drum brakes and bias-ply tires. The officer takes on exactly the same risk as the man he is trying to stop, and he takes it on deliberately, as a matter of procedure. That is the situation two engineers accidentally solved during the Second World War, while working on something else entirely. John Barker and Ben Midlock worked at the Automatic Signal Company. Barker had spent the 1930s on traffic lights. During the war, both men were working on military radar, and Grumman came to them with a problem that had nothing to do with cars. It concerned the PBY Catalina, an amphibious aircraft designed to land on water. Landing one on a runway was harder on the machine, and the aircraft were damaging their landing gear coming down. Nobody could measure how fast they were descending, and without that number, nobody could fix it. So Barker and Midlock built a Doppler radar unit. And because it was wartime and the parts they needed did not exist, they made the microwave resonators out of coffee cans, soldered shut. They set the thing up at the end of the runway at Grumman's Bethpage facility on Long Island, pointed it straight up at the sky, and it worked. Now hold that in your head. A device that can measure how fast an aircraft is coming down can measure how fast a car is coming toward you. Same principle, different direction. After the war, Barker put the equipment in the boot of his own car and drove out to the Merritt Parkway in Fairfield, Connecticut. He parked on the verge, opened the boot so the gear faced the traffic, and played policeman. By the spring of 1947, the Connecticut State Police were testing the unit on that same parkway. By June, it had a name: the Electro-Matic Radar Speed Meter. And that year, the town of Glastonbury, Connecticut, put Barker's machine on Route 2. That is generally described as the world's first speed trap. Here is the part I did not expect when I started reading about this. For nearly 2 years, nobody got a ticket. Connecticut used the equipment for traffic surveys and issued warnings, courtesy cards, not summonses. And Barker noticed something during that period which he wrote up in a 1948 issue of a journal called The Traffic Quarterly. As soon as the state police parked their radar truck beside the highway, traffic slowed down, even though the troopers were handing out warnings and nothing else. The deterrent worked before the enforcement did. The machine did not have to catch anybody to change how people drove. Its presence was the enforcement. That is a completely different theory of policing a road from the one the pursuit car represents, and the two have been in tension ever since. Enforcement proper began in February 1949, when the Connecticut State Police started issuing speeding tickets based on radar-recorded speeds. The New York Times covered it on the 6th of February. 2 days later, the same paper reported on a year-long trial out on Long Island at Garden City, New York, and noted that the system worked but was expensive. A local police captain named Ralph Buckley gave a reporter a line in 1949 that sums up the whole shift. He said this was the latest scientific method, that it removed the possibility of human error, and that any speeder who got caught would have to argue with a little black box. Now strip away everything you picture when you hear the word radar, because none of it exists yet. There is no gun, nothing handheld, nobody standing at the roadside pointing anything at anyone. Early traffic radar was a bulky vacuum tube installation. The units weighed tens of pounds, needed line power, and were mounted on tripods or carried in the boot of a car. They worked from a stationary position only, and they did not simply show you a number. The New Jersey equipment described in court in the mid-1950s included transmitting and receiving devices, a calibrated speed meter needle, and a permanent graph recording the speed of every car that passed through the beam. The radar produced a paper record. That is a very different evidentiary object from a digital readout, and it is worth remembering when you see period photographs of 2 or 3 officers standing around what looks like a piece of laboratory equipment. That is exactly what it was. Adoption was fast. By late 1952, Barker's device, sold in production as the automatic signal Electro-Matic speed meter, was in use in 31 of the then 48 American states, and in other countries too. Within about 5 years of a man parking on a Connecticut verge with equipment in his boot, radar had gone national. The manufacturers were mostly small firms that no longer exist, which is part of why this history is so poorly documented. But none of that mattered yet, because a speed measurement is worth absolutely nothing unless a judge will accept it, and the real fight over traffic radar was never technical. It was legal. The landmark case is called State versus Dantonio, decided by the New Jersey Supreme Court in 1955, and the facts of it are a perfect photograph of the era. On the 2nd of February, 1954, 3 state troopers named Armstrong, Traynor, and Trepasovsky set up as a radar team along the New Jersey Turnpike. Trooper Trepasovsky testified that he connected the power supply, allowed the machine to warm up, tested it, and confirmed that both the meter and the graph read 0 when there were no cars in range. And here is the detail that matters most for this channel. Trepasovsky did not chase anybody. When the vehicle came through the beam, he read the speed off the needle and the graph, noted the license number, and radioed it ahead to Trooper Armstrong, who was stationed 500 or 600 feet down the road, and made the actual stop. 2 officers, in 2 places, doing 2 different jobs. The man who proved the speed and the man who caught the car were no longer the same man. That is the whole shift, sitting right there in the trial record. That is a police radar operation in 1954. 3 men, a warm-up period, and a paper chart. Nothing about it resembles the thing you picture. And notice how much of that testimony is about procedure rather than about the machine, because the trooper is not there to explain how radar works. He is there to establish that he switched it on properly, checked it, and watched it read 0 when the road was empty. That distinction is about to matter enormously. The court held 3 things, and between them they shaped the next half-century of American traffic enforcement. First, that courts may take judicial notice of the general accuracy of radar speed measuring devices and of the Doppler principle. In plain terms, nobody has to bring in an expert witness to establish that radar works. The court will simply accept it. Second, that a few hours of training is enough to qualify an operator. And third, that the operator does not need to understand or be able to explain the machine's internal workings. Read those last 2 together and you have the reason radar spread across America as fast as it did. A department did not need engineers. It needed a box, an afternoon of training, and a power supply. But Dantonio left a gap, and that gap has occupied traffic courts from that day to this one. Judicial notice covers radar in general. It does not establish that this particular machine was working correctly on that particular day. Proof of the accuracy of the specific device remained a prerequisite for getting its reading into evidence, which is how a piece of Victorian laboratory equipment ended up in the boot of almost every patrol car in America. If you want more of this kind of detail, subscribing genuinely helps the channel keep digging for it. A tuning fork cut to a given speed emits a frequency identical to the Doppler shift a vehicle would produce traveling at that speed. Strike it, hold it in front of the antenna, and the unit should display the fork's number. It is cheap, it is elegant, and crucially, it is something a police officer can explain to a judge in one sentence. The Connecticut Supreme Court established the tuning fork as a reliable accuracy test in a 1966 case called State v. Tominelli, but courts quickly spotted the obvious hole in it. If the machine is only as good as the fork, what proves the fork? A New York court put it plainly that same year. Nobody had shown the fork itself was accurate, and it was entirely possible its pitch had drifted, in which case an inaccurate fork and an inaccurate radar could agree perfectly with each other and both be wrong. That question did real work, and here is where the two cases I promised you come in. In State v. Overton, New Jersey, 1975, a sergeant had tested his unit with 4 tuning forks, calibrated at 20, 40, 60, and 80 miles an hour. He did it 3 times, at the same location. The court accepted the external fork test as sufficient. In State v. Reading, New Jersey, 1978, an officer had used a single fork, cut at 50 miles an hour, whose own accuracy had never been established. He performed no other test. The court found that inadequate. 1 fork, unverified, not enough. 4 forks, repeatedly, before and after, enough. Somewhere between those two rulings sits the daily ritual of American traffic enforcement for the next 50 years. Every officer striking a tuning fork against the doorframe and holding it up to the antenna at the start of a shift is doing it because of the gap Dantonio left and the standard Overton and Reading set. 2 more developments closed out the era. The first was moving radar, a unit that can work from a patrol car that is itself in motion by measuring the ground speed of its own vehicle and subtracting it from the reading. That is a substantially harder problem than stationary radar, and it took a fresh round of legal argument because now the machine had to be right about 2 speeds at once. By the mid-1970s, courts were beginning to extend judicial notice to moving radar as well, and the same principle held. General acceptance of the technology, but proof still required that this particular unit was working on this particular day. The second was Vascar, which is not radar at all, and it is worth understanding because it is the answer to a problem radar created. Once radar became universal, radar detectors followed, and a device that broadcasts its own presence is a device that can be beaten. Vascar is a timing computer. The operator marks a known distance, times a vehicle across it, and the unit does the arithmetic. Because it emits nothing at all, no detector can see it coming. New Jersey litigated its accuracy in a 1974 case called State v. Finkel and, consistent with everything above, required proof of the particular device's accuracy. So by the end of the era covered on this channel, an officer had 3 ways to establish a speed. Pace it with a certified speedometer, measure it with radar, or time it with Vascar. Only one of those 3 required the police car to be fast. And that is the thing I keep coming back to. Every video on this channel about horsepower, about the 440, about the 147-mile-an-hour Polara, is in some sense about a problem that a coffee can solve in 1947. The pursuit car did not stop mattering. Officers still had to stop the car, and stopping a car that does not want to be stopped is a different job from measuring it. But for the first time since the invention of the automobile, catching a speeder and proving a speeder had become 2 separate tasks, and only one of them needed a big engine. Radar left fingerprints on the car itself, too. An early unit was a vacuum tube device drawing continuous power in a vehicle that was already running a tube radio, a siren, and lights. It is one more reason every police package in this history specified a heavy-duty electrical system, and one more reason the specification sheets kept quoting alternator output at idle rather than at speed. Because a radar car is, by definition, a stationary car with everything switched on. And it changed the argument in the courtroom. Before 1947, a speeding case was an officer's word against a driver's, decided on who the judge found more credible. After Dantonio, it was a number, produced by a machine that the court had already agreed to trust before either of them walked in. One last thing worth saying, because this channel cares about getting it right. The device Connecticut deployed in 1947 was not a radar gun. There was no gun. It was a mains-powered vacuum tube installation with separate emitter and receiver antennas, usable only from a standstill, that in some configurations drew a paper graph of every car that went past. Calling it a gun imports 30 years of miniaturization that had not happened yet. If you see a photograph captioned as an early police radar and it shows one officer holding something in one hand, the caption is wrong. Look instead for the tripods, the cables, the open boot, the car parked on the verge, and the 2 or 3 men standing around it. That is what catching a speeder actually looked like in 1949. So the next time you get flashed by something the size of a hairdryer, spare a thought for John Barker, driving out to the Merritt Parkway with a radar set in the boot of his own car, playing policeman 2 years before anybody thought to write a ticket with it. This has been Badges and Chrome, the channel that covers the police car's history almost forgot. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.